thought of this morning, as always, we need your understanding. We need your wisdom as we read and talk about and fellowship around your word, and do so not only with one another but with you. Have your way in our understanding, and then have your way in the way we respond to it and live accordingly. We commit our time to you, looking for what you have for us this morning, and praising your name with Christ. In his name we pray.
All right.
Now we've gone a little deeper into the tabernacle. We've got through the courtyard and the gate, and past the altar of blood sacrifice. And in the order of things, of course, you remember we come in through the outer gate into the courtyard where the altar is, and then the laver is, and then the tabernacle tent, the meeting place it's often called itself too, in which will be the holy place where these priests serve constantly 24 hours a day. And then you have the curtain that separates the holy place from the Holy of Holies. And of course the Holy of Holies is where the visible dwelling place of God was with Israel, in that they could see him. And as the pillar of fire by night and the pillar of cloud by day. So they could see his presence with them anytime, day or night, 24 hours a day, there in the Holy of Holies. But even the priesthood couldn't go in there. Only the high priest could go in there, and he could only go in there once a year after he had made a complete blood sacrifice for him and his sins, the high priest and his sins. And then he was able to continue on through into the dwelling place that one time a year, and that's when he went in for before God, for the whole nation as well as himself. So that's the trip through the tabernacle, and we've only got to this point, which is where we are right today. And if you'll notice, it's about the center of the tabernacle. And just keep that thought in your mind. Why does God have order to worship? And why does he have, in a general sense, why did he put the laver right in the middle of everything? And so we want to see what that is, what it means, what it was a foreshadow of, because it is in part a shadow of the person and work of Jesus Christ, the anointed one, the promised one. That's the Messiah. And so it's going to be important for us to take note of why God put a laver there, for what reason, and what does it picture for us concerning the Messiah. And we're going to just read in Exodus to get us started this morning. We're going to read verses 17 through 20. And you've already read this and studied this. And I'm sure you've got some things you learned that I hope you'll share too this morning as we take a look at this in a much closer way. And your curiosity may be piqued. May I asking why I handed out this scriptural liquid measurement terms. I've got something on here I've wondered about for years myself. Never quite understood it until I had to make a deeper study of it. And because I've gone so many years, I never really understood this until a couple weeks ago when I was studying it. And had to have answers for something I never followed up on before. And it's on this sheet. So did you get this, Jim and Alice? And so I'm kind of holding that back till we get to it. But I gave you this so I wouldn't have to interrupt our class just to hand it out. So you just hold this, put this aside until we get to it. which won't take us too long, I hope. But to get started, let's read Exodus chapter 30, just verses 17 to 21 to refresh what we've been reading and studying and what we're going to continue to talk about this morning. I'm reading out of the New American, chapter 30 of Exodus, starting at verse 17. And the Lord spoke to Moses. So now our ears ought to perk up. Because here's the true and the living God talking with a mere human, just like us. What would God say to a mere human like us? Well, let's see what God had on his mind here. Because we know, just from the context, that this is what God said and spoke to Moses while he was up on the mount, as he was giving Moses the law and all of the dimensions and parts of it, including the tabernacle. So we know that's where we are. Listen to what God said to him. You shall also make a laver of bronze with its base of bronze for washing. And you shall put it between the tent of meeting and the altar. And you shall put water in it. And Aaron and his sons shall wash their hands and their feet from it. When they enter the tent of meeting, they shall wash with water, that they may not die. Or when they approach the altar to minister, by offering up in smoke a fire sacrifice to the Lord. And so they shall wash their hands and their feet, that they may not die. That caught my eye right away, because it made me run through my heart for a minute just to sit there and think about this. Is what we're looking at here around the laver of any importance? What do you think? At verse 20, he said that they shall wash with water, that they may not die. Or when they approach the altar to minister, by offering up in smoke a fire sacrifice to the Lord. So he said that twice. So they shall wash their hands and their feet. Why? That they may not die. And it shall be a perpetual statute for them, for Aaron and his descendants throughout their generation. Who was Aaron?
He was Moses' brother.
Yeah, and what was his relationship with the Lord?
High priest.
That's right. God chose him to be high priest. He was, do you remember what tribe he's, well, pretty obvious, what tribe he was from?
Yeah.
Pardon me? He was a Levite. Right. But did you know that Aaron had an older brother? He had an older brother, and Reuben. Now Reuben, you know the law of the firstborn, where God had designated the firstborn of every animal, the firstborn of every fruit or vegetable, the firstborn of anything that's born belongs to the Lord. It's sanctified unto him. It belongs to him. Well, if Aaron had an older brother, why is Aaron the high priest? God chose him. God chose him, and he doesn't say why, but that developed later a big squabble, a big fight, and there was rebellion in the leadership of Israel just because of that. Reuben, we'll read here a little later about the fact that the descendants of Reuben that were alive at that particular time really took a burn. They created rebellion in more than one time, where they created so much rebellion that God had to destroy them. Opened up the earth and swallowed them, their family, their kids, their cattle, everything that belonged to them. God swallowed up because of their rebellion. And I'm just telling you that for this reason. You may wonder, why was this rebellion going on that we read about in this particular time of history? Well, it's because the descendants of Reuben felt they were getting cheated out of their standing in God's work. And why did God, in fact, they, at one point, you probably already read this part, they said, why are you guys acting so holier than thou, Moses and Aaron and so on? We're all Levites. That was their burn. We have as much right to be doing the things you're doing as you do. And after creating that kind of a rebellion, God destroyed them for it. And I'm just bringing that up so that's in the background of your mind, because we're going to run across those passages and you may wonder why this or wonder why that. That's pretty much the reason, was the fight for the right of the firstborn and the blessings of the firstborn and the responsibilities of the firstborn. We're unique. And according to Jewish custom, that and what God had said earlier, normally that would have been the case. But God made an exception here and made Aaron the high priest. Just pack that one away. And because that's going to come into play here also as we read this, about this portion of time and the way things were going. So my question still stands in verse 20. There's only one answer to the question. Is this serious business to God?
Yes.
The laver? We're not talking about the altar sacrifice. We're talking about the laver. Is the laver a serious thing? Yeah. Hey, do or die. Disobey in this area, and you're barking up the wrong tree. This is serious business to God, and if it's ignored, it can mean your life.
You couldn't make even your offering.
Couldn't even make a what?
You couldn't even do the burnt offering until after you were washed.
That's right. That's right. Especially during the time of Passover. So you're absolutely right. Basically, what is a laver? A wash basin? Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And it's a basin in which you put water and for the purpose of washing, as opposed to bathing. When you go after, when you have come in from work and you've got, dirt on your hands and all that, you don't go take a bath. You wash your hands. You wash. That point should be kept in mind too as we start talking about the laver. Now we're going to do 4 things. We're going to look at why it's where God put it. There's a positioning, a strategic, there's a good reason for putting it where he put it. We're going to look at that. Then we're going to look at the provision of a laver is what's the sanctify mean? It means to set apart. And the reason for this laver is because it enables your setting apart. We'll also, as we look at this section of it, we're going to say, what do we set apart for? It makes a big difference. What's the laver? Not only why is the laver where it is, but what's its basic purpose? Why did God provide it in the first place? And then we're going to study the purification by the Lord and what that includes. In fact, there's just as an introductory thought concerning that, let me read something I've read before, but I don't know if you remember it. But it's a little statement made by a man named Ryle. I don't know if you know J.C. Ryle, but a good man. He writes this concerning the purification by the Lord, and what he has to say touches on the laver. It doesn't say so, but listen to the thought he says. Because the laver is for purification, and purification has to do with what we call in our church lingo, holiness. Does God expect holiness? Does God want holiness? Does God demand holiness? Does God enable holiness in your life and in my life? Here's a thought that J.C. Ryle has to say in answer to that statement. He says, and he's talking about here in this life, without holiness on earth, we shall never be prepared to enjoy heaven. Pretty bold statement in it. Without holiness on earth, we shall never be prepared to enjoy heaven. Heaven is a holy place. The Lord of heaven is a holy being. The angels are holy creatures. Holiness is written on everything in heaven. How shall we ever be at home and happy in heaven if we die unholy? Wrap that one in your mind for a few minutes this afternoon. How should we... People talk about heaven like they want to go there right away, but yet, and that's a holy place filled with holiness, and do we really want that? How will we be happy there if that's the kind of place it is, if we're not happy with that kind of place here? If you live in unholiness, you're not going to be happy in heaven. God works in our life over and over and over again all the way through, and part of the reasoning behind his patience with us and his work in our life is he's making us holy, preparing us for an eternity in that kind of an environment, preparing us for an eternity in the presence of God who is like that. And he has prepared us in a shadow form of holiness in the center of a believer's life. It's right in the center of the believer's life, which is a significant place, and we'll notice why as we get to it here shortly. But I wanted to read that statement because I think that's one of the aspects of the Christian life that's been on a downward slope for a long time. As a nation, we've been on a downward slope for over 100 years. And as time goes by, those professing Christ as their Lord and Savior are becoming more unholy as the years go by. Until now, you walk out in society, you can't tell just by looking. You can't tell whether a person's whether you see holiness or we're so much like the world that you can't tell a difference. People think they can get away with things that are unholy today that even couple generations ago they would have denied it. I know there are things that if I did as a teenager, I would have been confronted by the members of the church to deal with my sin. Today it's natural, considered normal thing. Nobody attacks or helps any of us when we live in an unholy way. We make reasons for it, and it comes into our life, one little drip and dribble at a time until we accept most anything. And holiness doesn't mean, I'm speaking in general, not us per se, not everybody. But in general, professing Christianity today lives no differently than the unsaved do. I'm ready for an argument. Take a look. It's not rocket science to see that holiness is not vogue in today's society. So, and I believe one of the issues here is this. God put the means for cleanup. God has given us not only the reasons, but the capacity for purification, for dealing with sin before we ever serve Him. Can a person who has a lifestyle of sin be a fruitful servant in God's plan of salvation? I think this will answer the question. Is the study of the laver. And I believe what we're going to see pretty plainly is that purification comes before as well as during service. If you're going to be a servant of the Lord, if you're going to be the priest, back in Moses, if you're going to be a priest to God, you have to have a clean life. In two aspects at least, a worldly cleanliness and a heavenly cleanliness. And we'll have a chance to talk about what could those things be on a horizontal plane, and what are those things on a vertical plane. Because I really believe God cares about our holiness. God, and He told them back then, if you don't take care of holiness, what did He say? Lest you die. It's that important to God. And I just don't understand why professing Christianity is going against God in this respect. Do they not fear God anymore? Do we not consider it important anymore how I live, how I think, how I worship God? It's all up to whatever I feel like doing? Really? That's not what God is telling the priesthood back at that day. He says, this is for you, for purification, and you better do it or you will die. To me, that ought to catch my attention. Because the God I serve is the same God who wrote this for Israel. God hasn't changed. We've changed. And we need to change back in the way that God shows us how to do it. They had to deal with it then. You notice it didn't scare them a whole lot either, because they ended up dying, most of them. Because Israel went from one idol worshiping event to another. And they tried to put together the things they love as much, if not more, than the things God loves. So they would go worship the idols and false gods, and then walk across the street and go to the temple or go to the synagogue. You think God liked that? No, not even close. And it was that serious to Him. So purification comes before and during service. It's mandatory for a priest to serve God. And we'll be able to draw some parallels here too, because we know that the sons of Aaron was the priesthood that this was being given to. Are we involved in a priesthood today? You think the priesthood here is a shadow of today, of the priesthood that walks the earth today? The same God who gave this is the same God we serve. Do you think it makes a difference how we serve God? Do you think God has a way to serve Him that He validates, that He loves and encourages? Have you ever looked for it? Things we'll be involved in. Exodus 29, you were already there. So in verse 4, he puts it this way. We got to get to the right chapter here. I was there. Exodus 29, verse 4, he's talking about the unleavened bread that's in the holy place. We'll get to that one in the next lesson. But he says here, you're gonna be ministering priests to me. That's verse 1. And he talks about the sacrifice. Then in verse 2, he mentions worshiping him after the sacrifice is made. And he says, and unleavened bread and unleavened cakes mixed with oil, and unleavened wafers spread with oil. You shall make them of fine wheat flour. In other words, God is describing something to them that he wants to be done in their worship and in their service. And he just doesn't say, well, you don't make a sacrifice any old way you want to. He doesn't say when it comes to the table of showbread, oh, just make any old bread the way you want to make it, and put it in there anywhere you want to put it. God was giving them specifics. He says, I want it done carefully. I'm going to give you the details. Do it this way, make it this way, exhibit it this way, and use it in your worship the way I tell you to. Do it carefully and do it orderly. He was telling them specifics here. So this is an important thing, and it has to do with the contamination that the priesthood back then had in the world. New Testament gives us very specific information on our walk in this world and our exposure to this world and its values and its thinking and its ways. And it's a false God that replaces the true and the living God. We get contaminated with this world, not only on a physical level, but on a spiritual level. We get contaminated with false teachings and relationships with God that aren't according to his word. So we got two levels, two planes to deal with when it concerns contamination, because we get contamination. What do you do with yours? Don't answer that. Because I ask myself, what do I do with my contamination? First thing I do is admit I get contaminated. I get involved with the things of this world and sins, and they are just going to sit on my mind if I don't do something with them. And does God tell me anything to do with them? Yes, and we'll get into that too. But I'm answering some general questions right up front, because they used to get contaminated. Their feet would get dirty because they didn't have macadam and cement sidewalks and nice clean surfaces to walk on. Their feet got all dusty from the dirt of the ground, and they were wearing sandals, and they had to kick off their sandals. Their feet would be dirty. Remember Jesus in his Last Supper? And what did he do in that Last Supper, during that Last Supper? He washed the disciples' feet. He washed their feet, which says more than just meets the eye. It shows that where we walk makes a difference, and you can't help but get contaminated with it. We walk in a contaminated generation and society and all that. And then they were already supposed to have washed their hands, and because the things that we do with our hands cause the hands to get contaminated. So our walk, our way of life, and the things that we do need to be cleansed if we're going to worship God the right way. or if we're going to serve God in a way that honors God. It makes a difference. And I don't think our society, our Christian professing society, gives much thought to this. So, and it was very, very particular about it, even how they washed their hands and their feet. Now, we just remembered the event in the upper room, but let me read you something from Alfred Edersheim, where he's describing the way that the priest was designated to do this very thing. I think you'll find it interesting because in this portion that he's covering here, they're getting ready to prepare the laver for use. And listen to what he says, what Edersheim says. The priests had fallen, his brethren reminded him where the chafing dish, he calls it, was deposited, and not to touch any sacred vessel till he had washed his hands and feet. The fire on the altar was sufficient for the light, but he goes on to say that now out just beyond it where the laver is, he says, the hands and feet were washed by laying the right hand on the right foot and the left hand on the left. And he goes on to talk about the filling of the laver with water. And he says that in time, he's talking here about the temple, not the tabernacle earlier, but he's talking about later when it was made into a permanent place. And what they did here at the laver, he said, this was designed by a man named Ben Katine, I think is how you pronounce it, who also altered the laver so that 12 priests could, at the same time, perform their ablutions, their washings. 12 could do it at a time. So we're not talking about a water basin that we probably would pop into our mind when we're talking about a laver. Oh, washing basin, of water. You could have 12 priests washing in this at one time. And you'll see why here in just a minute. But I thought you might find that interesting how over the passage of time, even the things that God gave for tabernacle was, they would say, improved upon and made to a little different specifications than we're given what we're reading about the tabernacle. That's important to know. Because sometimes you read things later in their history, well, when they were in captivity and after the temple had been destroyed and then another one later on after the dispersion and the remnant came back, they built another temple. So things were done a little differently at different places, so it's kind of odd to run into descriptions that sometimes don't agree with one another. So they would wash their right hand and their right foot, then their left hand and their left foot. And that's how they did it. And very orderly, very specifically and careful. Turn to 2 Chronicles. 2 Chronicles chapter 4. Second Kings, 2 Chronicles. Over further than a lot of times think. Okay, here we are. 2 Chronicles 4. And once you get there, we want to look at verse 6 there, 2 Chronicles 4:6. And here he's describing the laver. And here he's telling us that it was a handbreadth thick. A handbreadth is the width of your hand, which would be around 3 inches. So it'd be about, that would be 3 handbreadths roughly. He goes on to say in verse 6, he also made 10 basins in which to wash, and he set 5 on the right and 5 on the left to rinse things for the burnt offering, but the sea was for the priest to wash in. The basins talked about there in the early part of verse 6 is the basins, the wash basins with water in them that were used to wash and clean the parts of the sacrificial animal. After it had been slain, they had to wash those parts, and they had, he said here, they made 10 basins to do that. That was to prepare the meat and the parts of the sacrificial animal, to wash those in. But and then notice the last phrase of verse 6, but the sea was for the priests to wash in. That kind of make you wrinkle up your forehead a little bit? What's he talking about here? When he says the sea, he says the sea was for the priests to wash in. What's the sea? Okay, if you don't know the answer to that, we're coming to it. We'll get to it well, no, I'll cover it right now. The sea was the laver. The laver period. The whole laver was called the sea. And you'll see why in a few minutes, because we'll let the word explain it to us. But he said, make these other basins for washing sacrificial parts. But the sea, the laver, is only for the priests and their need for cleansing, their need for dealing with contamination. Do we have something like that in the New Testament? Turn to 1 Peter 2:9. Just kind of hold your finger and go way back to 1 Peter chapter 2. Go to Hebrews and James and next page over. Okay, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. Is there anything there like this command only for us today? Where he mentions here in 1 Peter is talking to Christians, and verse 9 is a verse that I think probably many of us have committed to memory, where he tells the Christian, not the religious leaders, he's talking to the Christians here. You believer, you born again one, you are a chosen race, a royal what? Priesthood. Here's the New Testament priesthood. You are a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of Him. He is a holy God, see, who has called you out of darkness into His marvelous light. Has He changed? Has He changed from the Old Testament priesthood to the New Testament priesthood? The same principle still applies. We are, he says, a holy nation. A holy nation. We've been proclaimed holy. by the only true and living holy God. And we're people special to him for his own possession. And he goes on to say, what are we special to him for? What's the relationship between us? It was special between the Aaronic priesthood and God, especially when it came to worship. And he's saying here, he's quoting that and applying it to us today, because we are a priesthood. And he says, we're a people for God's own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him. Well, you could think of a whole bunch of his excellencies. Some theologians use the word, instead of the word excellency here, they use that as the word for the characteristics of God. I like the word perfections or excellencies, as opposed to what's the word usually used for? I heard somebody say attributes. That's the same word that's being described here. It's talking about God's attribute. We are here to tell those who don't know God what God is like. We are to be those who can explain God to those who don't know God. We are to proclaim his excellencies, his attributes, his perfections. What do you mean you don't believe there is a God? And then you could go into, that's our job, to tell the unsaved and those who don't know what the true and the living God is really like. That's what you're here for. That's what I'm here for. So that we are those that God uses to reveal himself to the blind. Isn't that an amazing thing? And he's called us out of darkness into his marvelous light. For you once were not a people, but now you are the people of God. You had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Enough said about that. We're exclusive for the relationship of worship and serving the true and the living God. And he has provided something absolutely necessary for us if we're going to do that. Can you guess what it is? We got to stay clean. We don't represent God when we don't look holy, we don't act holy, we don't think holy. We are not going to show the true character and the attributes of God to someone if we don't display those attributes ourselves. How are we going to live holy in front of the unholy? Laver. Jesus Christ is our laver. But Jesus Christ doesn't, the laver doesn't have feet on it that walk over and dump on you. And when it comes to being a laver in our society, for God isn't going to force us, make it unable for us to live an unholy life. God is our source. He's the one that does the cleansing. But we have to go to the laver and take advantage of the opportunity to be cleaned. Where's one place we all know to go to do that? From the Bible, from the New Testament? Anybody? You got dirty hands, you got dirty feet, you got a life. There's some sin, there's some contamination between you and God. How do you get rid of it? Confession. Can you think of a particular passage? If you'll confess your sins, he is faithful and just to forgive you of your sins and to cleanse you from all unrighteousness. How can I live a holy life? By taking all the contamination regularly to my laver, the center of my life, the center of everything involved in my relationship with Him and with the world around me. And so He's the laver, the source, and He expects me to do the same thing in relationship to Him that the Old Testament priests did. They did it in shadow form, in type form. They prefigured the fact that when you go to God and you take the cleansing that He's made available, the work gets done. And then you're capable of serving Him. Then you're capable of worshiping Him. Then you're capable of serving and loving one another. Without His work in the life as the place we go for cleansing every day, anytime there's a need for it, He's always available to fix that so that we can serve Him, serve one another, and worship Him. He is the laver. He's the place of cleansing. This was a place of cleansing in type and in shadow, but it was pointing to the fact that that's what Christ expects to do in our daily activities, in our daily thinking, in our daily response, in our daily attracting of the contamination that's all around us. So you can see there's a parallel here. Now, go to 1 Kings 7. In 1 Kings 7, just going to look at a couple verses, verse 23 and then verse 26. Okay, first, chapter 7, verse 23 says, he's talking here about the laver, and he says, now, excuse me, now he made the sea of cast metal 10 cubits from the brim to brim, circular in form, and its height was 5 cubits and 30 cubits in circumference. No small thing. I don't understand it yet, but I can see that that's significant in size. Verse 26 it tells us how thick it was. And it was a handbreadth thick, and its brim was made like the brim of a cup, as a lily blossom, and it could hold 2,000 baths. I read these two verses and I say, what? I'm reading and I understand the words, but I don't understand what they mean. Do you have any trouble with those too? I did. He said it's made of bronze mirrors. When God delivered Israel out of Egypt, the women were given those. They didn't have glass mirrors like we have. They used polished brass. They could see their reflection in these plates. We would call them a mirror. In fact, I think the Bible calls them mirrors. They're polished brass. They're so polished, they're just beautiful. They would look like glass, except with a little different shade of color. But it mentions the bronze sea here, and it mentions a bath here. I always wondered how much water is. He says that here that it could hold 2,000 baths. I'm thinking, what's a bath? Probably the amount of water it would take, like a bathtub. And I never followed up on it, and I never looked up on it until a couple of weeks ago. And I looked and found out that it's a technical term of measurement. And you're looking at the little handout I gave you, so you won't have to go search this out. But you can do it, just go to any Bible dictionary and go to measurements. And they'll list measurements of linear measurements, all different kinds. In one section there'll be liquid measurements, and what I've given you here is the Hebrew words that are in our Bible for different measurements, and you can figure it right out. They tell you right there. and I'm going from very large measurements to very small measurements. A homer is 10 baths. So if a homer is 10 baths, what's the next step? What do you got to do next? Well, yeah, you got to find out how big is a bath. And then it suddenly dawned on me, and it had it in there. What is a bath? A bath was a measurement of about 22 liters. A bath is 5.83 gallons of water. Now, we just read that this laver can hold 2,000 baths. All you got to do is take 2,000 times 5.83 gallons of water, and it'll come out to 11,660 gallons of water. I wanted to ask one of our technical people how much our tank holds here for baptisms. I don't know, but I know one thing, 11,500 gallons of water, a lot of water, right? Let me give you some measurements that may astound you, because up till now I probably thought a laver was huge, about like this. A laver I'll give you the diameter, height, circumference, thickness, volume. We've already looked at the volume. Holds 11,000 gallons of water. And the diameter, listen to this, but you'll have to visualize it. Visualize it is not easy. A laver, is 15 feet in diameter. 15 feet. Help me out, Jim.
I'll go. This is my job, I did this before.
And you're good at it. We want 15 feet. 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 and a half to be up to here. That's how far it was across the laver. Can you imagine? I went up I did go up on the baptismal. That's about the same, if we went up there, that would be just about that same size as that opening with maybe 1 foot on each side. A laver was that big diameter. Fill that thing up, and so it's that big around
So it
too.
was around, like all
Oh,
this
yeah.
way around.
Yeah, how deep was it?
Yeah.
Huh?
How deep was it?
Didn't tell me. Well, it did tell me, but I'd have to figure it out, because it said it would hold 2,000 baths. So we would have to take, somebody who's good with math, would take the diameter and then see how far that many gallons would go if put into something that size. But I wanted to see how big a laver, I was thinking a laver was like this. It's not even close. That's the diameter of a laver.
And that was a brass casting.
Yeah.
And how big was the mold in order to form that?
Yeah, amazing. Well, and I know that the rim around it is
Thickness of your hand.
thick, yeah, that thick.
Yeah.
So, of brass. Right. It was a little time consuming to do it, but it left my understanding of the laver completely different up until this point in my life, because I always thought, I didn't know the word bath was actually a measurement that you could figure out. So I finally come to know that a bath is 2,000 baths would be 11,500 gallons. Its height was 7.5 feet. No, I don't know how full that got, but 7.5 feet's good long way up there. What's a basketball net?
10.
That's 10 feet? So I would assume, without just holding the thing up in the air, that 7.5 feet's pretty tall. This was no small thing. What is it, 7.5 feet? There's 7.5 feet. Thing was that tall. Anyway, it's tall. I'll just let it go down to the floor. That's how tall it was, and that'd be around. Huge, 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 huge. They must have had some dirty priests to contaminated priests, and I would assume that we're no better.
This is the temporary,
This is a tabernacle,
so they had to carry that thing.
yeah.
Yeah.
Don't ask me how they did that.
How did they stay clean between the brazen laver and,
What do you mean, how did they stay
well, they
clean?
had to walk the.
Here's where they had to come from the sacrifice to the laver.
Right,
And that's where they became ceremonially clean.
but then they had to walk further to get into the
Into here,
tabernacle.
yeah.
So how they stay clean between,
Good question.
they'd get dirty again.
There's not two lavers, so you think maybe he should have put that laver right next to the door?
That's what I would do.
There's a lot of, yeah, good, it's a good question.
Well, if where he is holy ground.
That's kind of like us asking, well, I just got done confessing all my sin to the Lord. Now, what's going to keep me clean, for the rest of the day or until I come in contact with the world again? We're just batting things around because the Bible doesn't give us any answer to that question. But it's an interesting thought. Yeah, Jim?
This later that you're describing here, is that the one in the temple or is it tabernacle?
I was taking down measurements that were given to me out of the description that's in the Bible dictionary, as well as what Edersheim wrote. And to tell you the truth, I'm not absolutely sure. So, but if the one in the temple had its source in what God told him to do in the tabernacle, I would assume they were somewhere near each other, if not exact. I don't
The
know.
tabernacle had a portal.
Yeah,
Yeah, this would weigh more than 15 tons. I was just figuring it out.
15 ton.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Without the,
Yeah.
the bottom.
Well, that's your assignment for next week.
So during the desert for 40 years, they had this with them.
The one that God gave them. Now, I can say this. The Bible doesn't give any dimensions to the laver that God didn't give Moses any measurements for this that I can find. But as Jim was saying, if you're going to make it out of brass and it's this big, I'm assuming that that's really the measurements for the one that ended up being in the temple. And all I would say, in fact, because I read a statement that said God did not give Moses measurements for the one coming down off the mount. And he said because one of the reasons that the writer gave for that was God's cleansing is always sufficient and always available, and therefore God didn't give any dimensions for it. That's the answer, the only thing I read that related to it. And I believe that if you go looking for measurements for the laver, like he gives you measurements for the altar and so on, you won't find them. But these measurements I gave you are measurements from the one that I'm assuming is out of the tabernacle, out of the temple. Yeah. No matter how you cut it, you've got a laver right in the center of worship and right in the center of relationship, and it's so important that God tells them that if they don't use it, they could die for it. And we could make a lot of assumptions from that too. Do you think there are Christians who didn't stay cleansed and lost their life because of it? Ananias and Sapphira, a good example of Christians who didn't keep their relationship right and holy, and didn't keep the relationship with the body true and holy. God took them immediately. So there are parallels as well as realities, but exact measurements for this, just the ones that they could measure, which would be the ones out of the temple. I agree with that. Can we stop here? We have to. We got down through, we approached A. Next week we'll do A, and any more we can get beyond to maybe A and B. All right. God's good. Let's pray. Thanks, Father, for your word. And we constantly need your teaching. We constantly need to not only just know certain things mentally, we need to know relationships. We need to experience the personal intimacy that is meant by the shadows. And it's our desire to know it and live it. And it takes a relationship with you to make that happen. Thank you for the privilege and the opportunity. In Jesus' name, amen.